The forest had always been my sanctuary, a place where the silver light of the moon painted the leaves in ethereal patterns, and tonight, as I knelt by the quiet stream that cut through the edge of the pack's territory, I could feel the pulse of life in every ripple, every rustle of the wind through the branches, and yet, despite the calm that wrapped around me like a familiar blanket, there was a tension I could not place, a sense that the world had shifted imperceptibly while I went about the ordinary rhythms of my life. I brushed a strand of hair from my face, watching the water reflect the moon with a clarity that made the small imperfections of my life seem trivial. Yet the quiet of the evening was almost too perfect, like a canvas waiting for the first stroke of a storm, and as I traced the smooth stones beneath my fingers, I noticed it, just beyond the reach of the golden glow spilling from the moon, a shadow that didn't belong, a presence that made the hairs along my neck prickle with the thrill of the unknown, subtle, yet impossible to ignore. Kael, though I did not yet know his name, lingered in that darkness, a dark, muscular wolf whose form was mostly hidden among the trees, save for the faint, unnatural gleam of a single red eye that reflected the moonlight in a way that seemed both unnatural and knowing, as if he had been watching me for far longer than the night allowed. His gaze tracing my movements with the patience of someone who understood more than they revealed, a quiet observer who moved with the fluid grace of a shadow, silent, yet palpably present, like the undercurrent of the forest itself, and the longer I stared, the more I felt an inexplicable pull toward that small, glowing ember of awareness, a fascination tempered by instinctual caution, as though part of me recognized him not as a threat, but as a guardian, or perhaps a harbinger of things yet to come. I let the breeze carry the scent of pine and earth to my senses, grounding myself in the familiar, yet my mind could not shake the image of that red eye, flickering from branch to branch, watching, waiting, measuring, and in the quiet moments between heartbeats, I could almost hear the faintest murmur, like a word carried from far away, teasing the edge of my consciousness with a promise I could not yet define, a message hidden in the folds of night, whispering that my life, simple and contained as it had been, was on the verge of transformation, that something beyond my comprehension was stirring in the shadows, and though I wanted to dismiss it as imagination or the tricks of moonlight on water, there was a weight to it, a gravity that tugged at the edges of my awareness, and the forest itself seemed to lean closer, listening with me, holding its breath in anticipation of the shift, the first quiet tremor of a destiny I was not yet ready to claim. I thought of the pack, sleeping just beyond the ridges of the trees, their forms curled in restful slumber, unaware of the subtle stirrings of a presence that existed just beyond their perception, and I realized that the ordinary world I had known, the one that hummed with routine and quiet predictability, was perhaps only an illusion, a delicate balance poised on the edge of something far more complex and far more dangerous, yet exhilarating in a way that made my heart drum faster beneath my chest. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, tasting the crisp night air tinged with the scent of pine, wet earth and distant fires from beyond the hills, trying to anchor myself in the calm I had always known, but the feeling of eyes upon me would not relent, and I could not shake the sense that Kael, the shadow in the distance, the silent observer, held more than mere curiosity in his gaze, that beneath that glowing red eye lay secrets I was not yet meant to know, a knowledge of the forest, the pack, and perhaps even me, that was both terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. I found myself moving instinctively, stepping back from the water's edge, the soft moss beneath my feet absorbing the sound of each motion, and yet every instinct in my being told me not to turn away completely, to remain aware of the unseen presence, as though acknowledging him might be the first step in understanding the subtle currents that had begun to ripple through my life. A rustle in the leaves, a soft, deliberate sound, made my heart skip, yet when I turned fully, I saw nothing but the sway of the trees and the silver light pooling across the forest floor. And still, the sense of being observed did not abate, a tension that made the ordinary night feel suddenly fragile, as if the threads holding reality together had loosened, just slightly, enough for something else, something extraordinary to slip through. My fingers brushed the edge of the stream once more, tracing patterns in the water that seemed to shimmer unnaturally beneath the moonlight, and I caught the reflection again, not of myself alone, but a fleeting image of a dark, powerful form that dissolved before I could name it, leaving only the echo of a presence that had been there all along, a sentinel in the shadows whose motives were hidden, whose allegiance was unknown, and yet, in a way I could not explain, I trusted that his gaze was not meant to harm, but to guide, to witness, to stir the first threads of a story I was only beginning to live. I thought of the tales I had heard as a child, of wolves that moved between worlds, guardians and harbingers, spirits of forest and moonlight, and I shivered at the thought that perhaps the legends were not just stories, that perhaps Kael, the silent rogue who prowled the edges of the night, was one such being, a creature whose purpose and destiny were intertwined with mine in ways that would reveal themselves only with time, patience and courage. Yet even as I felt the pull of wonder and the stirrings of destiny, there remained the unshakable familiarity of home, the sounds of the forest I knew, the gentle babble of the stream, the comforting solidity of the earth beneath my feet, the way the air felt against my skin, and in that familiarity, I felt both the warmth of what was known and the thrill of what was unknown, the tension between comfort and adventure, between the life I had always lived and the life that was quietly calling me from the shadows. I rose slowly, brushing moss from my knees, and glanced toward the distant treeline once more, where I could still feel the presence, the glowing red eye, a silent witness to my thoughts, my choices, my very being, and in that instant I understood that this ordinary night, this quiet, mundane moment by the stream, was anything but ordinary, that the subtle stirrings of something extraordinary had begun, and though I did not yet know what lay ahead, I felt a shiver of anticipation and a curious hope that the shadow watching me, the wolf with the secret red eye, would be part of the journey, a guide, a warning, or perhaps even the key to understanding a destiny that had begun to unfold in the hush of the forest. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and distant earth, and I froze for a heartbeat, sensing the tension in the world around me, feeling that the night itself waited for a choice, a movement, a decision, and as I stepped lightly onto the moss-covered stones to leave the stream behind, my eyes caught the faintest flicker of red once more, disappearing between the shadows like a promise, a secret, a story waiting to be told, leaving me with a soft, unanswerable question echoing in the quiet. Who or what was Kael, and why did it feel as though he had been waiting for me all along? The morning light filtered through the trees with a softness that made the forest shimmer. Yet even in the gentle warmth, I sensed something had shifted. The air felt heavier, charged in a way I could not name, and every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, even the murmur of the stream, seemed sharper, more deliberate, as if the forest itself had taken on a consciousness tuned to my presence. I moved carefully along the familiar path to the clearing where the pack often gathered, noting how my heartbeat seemed to synchronize with the rhythm of the earth beneath my feet, a steady pulse that carried both comfort and an unexplainable tension, and then I saw it, a flash of dark fur between the trees, too swift, too silent to belong to any ordinary wolf, and for a heartbeat I thought it was my imagination until a faint glimmer of red caught my eye, a single glowing hue that lingered long enough for me to recognize it as the same piercing red that had watched me by the stream, Kael's eye, unwavering and inscrutable, hidden yet present, observing me as though measuring the first tremors of change within my own soul. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on the familiar moss under my boots and the soft whisper of the wind, yet the air seemed to hum with subtle anomalies, a rustling that followed me even when no branches moved, shadows that shifted with no light to cast them, and the uncanny sensation that eyes, not just Kael's, were watching from places I could not see, but always through the rogue wolf, his presence a silent tether between the natural and the mysterious, his motives unknowable yet inescapable. My senses, once ordinary, now flickered with unexpected awareness, small tremors of intuition that tingled through my fingers and the back of my neck, emotions rising and falling in ways I could not explain, a surge of alertness and unease that left me both exhilarated and anxious. And with every step I noticed the forest responding, the birds quieting as if they sensed the shift, the wind pausing mid-breath, and even the stream seeming to slow, carrying ripples that danced across its surface in patterns I could not predict, as though the elements themselves were waiting for something just beyond my comprehension. Then there were the fleeting signs Kael left behind, subtle as the trail of a shadow slipping through the trees, branches bent unnaturally, footprints that seemed to appear and vanish without explanation, a low whisper in the wind that could have been nothing, yet sounded almost like words meant only for me. Change is nearer than you think. And I found myself stopping mid-step, heart hammering, scanning the forest with a mixture of curiosity and unease, knowing that the rogue wolf's influence was already at work, guiding me toward truths I was not yet prepared to grasp. Even the pack, in their distant gatherings, moved with an unconscious awareness I could feel. In the tension of the air, in the subtle shifts of their posture and the alertness in their eyes, and I realized that something invisible was threading through everything, a current of energy that both beckoned and warned, that had begun to alter the rhythm of life I had taken for granted. I felt the first stirrings of instinctive power, small and fleeting, like a spark in the marrow of my bones, emotions blooming in sharp, unexpected bursts, anticipation, fear, curiosity, a strange pull toward the places Kael lingered without entering, as though my own destiny was intertwined with his shadowy path, yet entirely separate, a delicate balance of autonomy and unseen guidance, and with every glance in his direction, I felt the weight of being watched without being touched, studied without judgment, known without explanation, and I realized that he existed on the edge of the world I understood, a sentinel at the boundary between ordinary life and the extraordinary forces awakening within me. I paused at the edge of the clearing, sunlight breaking through in jagged beams that illuminated dust motes floating lazily in the air, and for a brief, uncanny moment, I thought I saw Kael emerge fully from the shadows, a towering, muscular form blending into the forest as if it belonged there, his red eye glinting with intelligence and purpose, yet as soon as I blinked, he was gone, leaving only the sense of being followed, of being measured, of being tested. And in that sudden emptiness, a new awareness settled into my mind. The ordinary world I had known had quietly begun to fracture, leaving behind the faint, thrilling resonance of change, a whisper of destiny that was both exhilarating and unnerving. And just as I turned to continue along the path, the wind shifted again, carrying the faintest rustle, the ghost of a low, deliberate growl, a reminder that Kael was near, watching, guiding, holding secrets I could not yet name, and that whatever path I chose next would be illuminated, however faintly, by the eyes of a rogue wolf whose presence promised both revelation and challenge, leaving me with a quiet, insistent question burning in the edges of my mind. What would he show me next? The forest seemed to hold its breath the moment he appeared, stepping into the clearing with a presence that made the very air hum with energy, the alpha, tall and commanding, his fur dark as midnight and eyes like molten amber, observing the world with a measured intensity that made my pulse quicken even as my instincts screamed caution. He moved with the confidence of one who had walked countless paths yet carried the weight of unspoken burdens, and the pack immediately fell into a rhythm around him, a living tide of loyalty and tension that made me feel both drawn to and wary of him, as though I were witnessing the center of a storm I could not yet comprehend. I stepped forward, every sense heightened, and even in the familiar scent of the forest, there was something new, something layered and potent, a power I could not name, that radiated from him like warmth and danger intertwined, and my heart stuttered in recognition of a connection that seemed older than the memory of my own life, a tether I could feel pulling me toward him even before our eyes met fully. Yet even in the gravity of his presence, I could not forget the flicker at the edge of the trees, the shadowy silhouette of Kael moving silently, his red eye catching the faint light like a distant ember, a reminder that every motion, every heartbeat, was being observed, measured, understood in ways I could not yet grasp. A low wind rustled through the leaves, carrying with it the faintest murmur, Kael's voice almost a whisper carried on the night air. Your alpha isn't who you think he is. And though the words were brief, cryptic, they struck a chord deep within me, sending a ripple of unease across the calm surface of fascination I felt toward the towering figure before me. I watched the alpha as he paused at the center of the clearing, scanning the forest with a gaze that seemed to penetrate layers beyond sight, and in the moments that followed, I noticed the subtle things, the way the pack shifted almost imperceptibly at his presence, the quiet gravity in their stance, the way even the smallest movements seemed orchestrated by an unseen rhythm, a pattern I could feel but not yet fully understand. The forest itself seemed to bend to his will, the streams reflecting the moonlight in brighter patterns, the shadows stretching longer as though drawn toward him, and my senses, already heightened, caught every nuance, every vibration in the air, as if the world had suddenly become a living instrument tuned to the alpha's quiet command. Kael lingered at the edge of my vision, a constant, unsettling presence, his form blending with the darkness, yet impossible to ignore, and every time I thought I had fully focused on the alpha, Kael's red eye flickered, a reminder that the truths I was beginning to sense were layered, complicated, and perhaps not fully visible to me yet, and that the rogue wolf's insight might hold the key to understanding what I could not yet name. I felt my own instincts stir, a mix of awe and trepidation, a sense of magnetic pull toward the alpha tempered by the subtle warning embedded in Kael's words, the forest vibrating with the tension of unseen threads weaving between us, threads that tugged at my heart, my mind, and my very soul. The alpha's voice finally broke the silence, rich and calm, speaking to the pack in a tone that was both commanding and protective, and I realized that his presence alone shaped the rhythm of the forest, yet something in his gaze flickered briefly toward me, acknowledging my existence with a weight that made the world narrow around us, and I felt a strange electric resonance as if the moment itself carried meaning beyond what I could articulate. Kael's eye caught mine for a fraction of a second, a silent signal that this connection was not simple, that there were layers of history and destiny hidden beneath the surface of this encounter. And though the Alpha smiled faintly, a gesture both gentle and enigmatic, I sensed that what I was seeing was not all that he was, that the magnetic energy he carried hid shadows and secrets as deep as the forest itself. Every instinct screamed that something monumental had begun, that my life, which had once felt ordinary in its rhythm and smallness, had suddenly intersected with forces both powerful and ancient, and that Kael, ever the observer, ever the shadow at the edge of things, would not let me navigate this moment blindly. A sudden rustle drew my eyes to the tree-line, where Kael disappeared into the darkness as quickly as he had appeared, leaving only the echo of a presence and the weight of his cryptic warning, and I realized that the mysterious pull between the Alpha and myself, heightened by Kael's silent, unseen guidance, was only the first tremor of a destiny that would soon demand decisions far beyond anything I had ever imagined. As the sun dipped lower, casting long silvered shadows across the clearing, I felt the stirrings of change ripple through me, an unfamiliar heat in my chest and a shiver of anticipation that was equal parts fear and exhilaration, and though the Alpha's attention seemed fixed on the distant horizon, I could not shake the sense that this encounter had already begun to rewrite the map of my life, that Kael's shadow would linger at every turn, and that the magnetic presence of the Alpha was not simply a force to admire, but a force that would demand courage, intuition, and the subtle unraveling of truths I was not yet ready to confront, leaving me suspended in the quiet tension of the forest, heart hammering, breath caught, and utterly captivated by the unknown that had just stepped into my world. The days that followed felt like walking through a world both familiar and strange, as though the ordinary threads of my life had loosened and the forest itself was subtly rearranging around me, carrying whispers of change I could not yet name. My mornings, once predictable and calm, began to ripple with small, inexplicable coincidences, a leaf falling in perfect rhythm with my heartbeat, the way the wind seemed to shift just as I moved, the distant howl of a wolf echoing like a message meant only for me, and in every moment, I felt a surge of emotions that had no clear source, a mixture of anticipation, unease, and a strange exhilaration that left my chest both tight and wide, as if my body had begun to sense truths my mind could not yet grasp. I tried to anchor myself in routines, brushing the moss from familiar paths and tracing the edges of streams I had walked countless times, yet even in these simple actions, subtle disruptions reminded me that the world I had known was no longer stable. Shadows lingered longer than they should, glimmers of movement appeared at the corners of my vision, and the scent of the forest carried layers I had never noticed before, hints of power, presence, and intention that were both alluring and disquieting. And then there were the dreams, brief flashes that came unbidden in the still moments before sleep, images of vast forests under moonlight, of eyes gleaming in darkness, of a figure moving silently between shadows, always just beyond reach, always watching, and in these dreams, I felt the pulse of another consciousness, sharp, calculating, aware, and I understood instinctively that it was Kael, though he spoke nothing. His presence woven into every scene, leaving subtle hints of what was coming. A branch bent unnaturally in the distance, a low murmur in the wind, the flash of red that burned briefly in my mind's eye. I began to notice his influence even in waking hours, an unsettling feeling that my choices were not entirely my own, that some unseen current guided my steps, pushing me toward certain paths and away from others, and though the nudges were gentle, they carried the weight of inevitability, leaving me both comforted by the silent guidance and unnerved by the knowledge that Kael was always watching, always aware of my movements, measuring my reactions, offering cryptic warnings that I could not fully interpret. The forest responded to me differently now, as if my senses had sharpened beyond human limits, each leaf, each ripple of water, each rustle of wind carrying meaning, and I could feel the tension in the pack from afar, subtle vibrations of anticipation and alertness that I had never noticed before, as though they too were sensing the unseen shifts in the balance of our world. I caught glimpses of Kael at the edge of perception, his dark, muscular form moving like liquid shadow between the trees, his red eye flickering in the corners of my vision, silent, observant, and for a moment, I swore I heard him murmur, "The world bends before those who see." And the words left a shiver along my spine, a recognition that my understanding of reality was expanding faster than my ability to process it, that ordinary life was no longer mine to claim, and that the boundaries between the known and unknown were dissolving with every heartbeat. Small coincidences began to build into patterns I could not ignore, like the way the Alpha's presence seemed to resonate in the air even when he was distant, how the pack moved in subtle synchrony with forces I could not name, and how the forest itself seemed to conspire to guide me toward encounters, revelations, and choices that were accelerating faster than I could anticipate. One afternoon, while tracing the path along the riverbank, I noticed paw prints that did not belong to any pack member. Deep and deliberate, leading into thickets I had never dared enter, and at their end, a single red glint caught my eye, Kael's subtle signature, a silent message that said more than words could, warning me, guiding me, teasing me with the promise of revelation. My heart raced as I realized that the patterns forming in my life were not random, that every dream, every coincidence, every surge of emotion was connected, threads weaving together to pull me toward a destiny that had been quietly shaping itself for months, perhaps years, and that Kael, ever the silent rogue, was both the observer and the catalyst, a force I could neither ignore nor fully understand, yet one whose influence was undeniable. I began to understand that my ordinary world, the life I had relied on for stability, for comfort, for certainty, was shifting under my feet, not violently, not destructively, but with a subtle, insistent pressure that demanded attention, demanded adaptation, demanded courage, and the more I felt the pull of these changes, the more I sensed that the Alpha's presence, the pack's reactions, and Kael's quiet interventions were threads of the same tapestry, each tugging me toward a revelation I had yet to see clearly. And as twilight crept across the forest, painting the leaves in silver and gold, I paused on a familiar stone at the river's edge, my reflection rippling across the water, mingled with shadows that did not belong to me. And in that reflection, I saw for the first time the subtle hints of the changes within myself. A sharper gaze, a quickened heartbeat, an awareness that extended beyond what was visible, a connection to the world around me that was no longer just instinct but something larger, something alive, something threaded through with Kael's presence and the silent, magnetic pull of forces I had not yet named. And in that moment of quiet, I realized with a shiver that nothing in my life would ever be ordinary again, that the familiar rhythms, the comfortable routines, the sense of being safe in the predictable had dissolved like mist, leaving me suspended in the tension of possibilities, and that the forest, the Alpha, the pack, and Kael, the rogue who watched from the shadows, were all part of a world I was only beginning to understand, a world in which every choice, every glance, every heartbeat carried meaning, and that the realization of this truth changed everything I thought I knew, opening a door I could not close, a path I could not ignore, and a destiny that was quietly, inexorably calling me forward. The days that followed carried a rhythm that felt both familiar and profoundly new, as if the forest itself had begun to hum with the growing resonance between the Alpha and me, and I found myself noticing the smallest gestures that spoke volumes, the way his amber eyes softened when he observed the pack, the tilt of his head when he acknowledged my presence, the subtle shift in his stance when he allowed me closer in moments of ritual or routine, and every interaction carried a weight that tugged at my chest, threading curiosity, respect, and a tentative sense of trust through each heartbeat. Even simple conversations, exchanged in the quiet spaces between the rustling of leaves and the flow of water, felt charged with meaning, as if words themselves carried unspoken truths, and I realized that I was beginning to understand not only his strength but the vulnerabilities he held tightly beneath the surface, the moments when his gaze faltered or his expression softened, revealing a depth of feeling the pack rarely glimpsed, and in response, I felt an awakening within myself, a sense of purpose, alignment, and recognition that went beyond mere companionship. Kael's presence lingered at the edges of my awareness, a constant, silent observer whose glowing red eye slipped between shadows like a thread connecting my growing understanding to something larger and unseen, and sometimes, in the quietest moments, I caught the faintest sign of him, a rustle of leaves that seemed to respond to my movements, a subtle imprint in the soft earth, or a low, almost inaudible murmur carried by the wind. Trust is earned where shadows meet, and though cryptic, it left an impression that resonated in my chest, nudging me to notice subtleties I might otherwise have ignored. As the pack moved through their daily routines, I began to notice the way the Alpha observed me in turn, his patience deliberate, his acknowledgement of my presence unspoken but undeniable, and I found myself returning his gaze, feeling a pull that was at once comforting and disquieting, a current of connection that threaded between us with quiet insistence, yet never rushed, never forcing, and always balanced on the fine edge of respect and curiosity. And it was in these moments of mutual awareness that the forest itself seemed to lean closer, listening to our unvoiced conversations, reflecting the tension, the promise, and the potential that hung between us like dew on the leaves. Kael moved through the periphery of these moments, never intruding yet impossible to ignore, his form a dark, fluid presence that seemed to guide the edges of my perception, and on more than one occasion I caught a subtle sign, a branch angled oddly, a footprint half buried in moss, the faintest glint of red in the distance, that reminded me he was watching, that he was quietly ensuring that the connection I was building was unfolding in a direction that aligned with forces I could not yet name, a guardian of sorts, who balanced the intensity of our growing bond with his own inscrutable purpose. As the days passed, I began to recognize patterns in the Alpha's attention, the way he anticipated my presence without being told, the subtle gestures that indicated awareness of my moods and thoughts, and I responded with equal attentiveness, the dance of awareness and empathy between us deepening with each shared moment, each exchanged glance, each silence that carried meaning. And I felt the emotional tension rise not as something dangerous but as something vital, a current that strengthened the bond. Without ever demanding it, a connection that was both exhilarating and grounding, a tether to something larger than either of us alone. One afternoon, while walking along the edge of the stream, I paused to observe him as he tended to the pack, his movements precise, deliberate, yet softened by the care he showed those around him, and I felt a wave of admiration that carried an unfamiliar ache, a realization that my feelings were shifting from respect and curiosity to something deeper. Something that tied me to him in ways I could not yet name, and as I lingered watching, Kael's presence manifested subtly, a shadow among the trees, a fleeting flash of red in the corner of my eye, a whisper on the wind that seemed to thread through my mind. The heart recognizes what the eyes cannot yet see, and the cryptic words settled heavily, stirring a mixture of hope and apprehension within me, leaving me acutely aware that the bond one felt was not merely circumstantial but guided, observed, and perhaps tested by forces beyond my understanding. The Alpha finally turned toward me, and for a heartbeat our eyes locked, an exchange of emotion passing silently through the space between us, conveying acknowledgement, curiosity, and an unspoken invitation to step further into understanding, and I found myself instinctively meeting it, a surge of warmth coursing through my chest, grounding me even as it excited a nervous anticipation, and in that shared awareness I sensed the first true depth of our connection, a recognition of resonance that went beyond words, beyond the physical, into the emotional and spiritual threads that bound Pack and Luna, leader and companion, together. Kael shifted again, imperceptibly, just enough to make me aware of his continued vigilance, and I realized that he was not only observing but subtly influencing the currents around us, guiding me to notice nuances I might otherwise miss, shaping the unfolding connection in a way that would ensure it grew with clarity and purpose, his cryptic presence a reminder that every emotional surge, every instinctive reaction, carried meaning, and that the delicate balance of trust and understanding we were forming was being watched and weighed by eyes that saw beyond the surface. As twilight fell and painted the forest in hues of violet and silver, I found myself sitting near the stream, the Alpha at a distance yet still profoundly present, and I reflected on the intensity of the bond that had grown between us, sensing in my chest a warmth that was both comforting and stirring, a connection that defied the ordinary patterns of my previous life, and I realized for the first time that this bond was not solely my own, that it existed in concert with the awareness and quiet orchestration of Kael, whose subtle signs and shadowed presence had guided me without interference, allowing the connection to flourish while keeping me tethered to awareness and caution. And in that quiet, suspended moment, as the last light of day filtered through the leaves and the forest exhaled around us, I felt a sudden, unexpected wave of emotion, a pang of understanding that struck me with clarity and depth. The connection I shared with the Alpha was only the beginning, a single thread in a tapestry far larger than I could yet perceive, and Kael, always in the shadows, had ensured that I was ready to recognize it, to feel it, to accept it, leaving me with a profound realization that changed everything I thought I knew about trust, awareness, and the unseen forces guiding the unfolding story. A a revelation that shimmered in my chest like moonlight on water and demanded that I step forward, heart open, into a world forever transformed. The night air carried a sharp clarity that made every rustle of leaves and distant howl resonate through the forest like the first strike of a bell, and I moved cautiously along the familiar trail toward the clearing where the Alpha often stood. In quiet command, feeling the weight of anticipation pressing against my chest as though the forest itself were holding its breath, something had shifted in the rhythm of the world, a tension I could sense threading through the pack, through the wind, through my own pulse, and I knew without knowing why that secrets long buried were ready to surface, truths that would reshape everything I had believed about the forest, the pack, the Alpha, and even myself. Kael's presence was there immediately, though unseen, a shadow blending with the darkness, his glowing red eye catching faint glimmers of moonlight and, though he said nothing, the subtle signs he left, an oddly bent branch, the faint imprint of massive paws, a whisper in the wind like a thought half-formed, spoke louder than words, guiding me toward the revelation that had been hovering at the edges of my awareness for days, a truth I had felt but could not yet name. As I reached the clearing, the Alpha was already there, standing tall beneath the silver glow of the moon. His amber eyes fixed on something beyond me, on a vision I could not yet see, and I felt the forest pulse in time with my own heartbeat, each rustle of leaf and shifting shadow vibrating with significance. And then in the quiet, I realized that the signs Kael had left were pointing me toward the ground where the earth itself seemed to shimmer with subtle energy, like a language written in roots and stone that only someone attuned to the forest could decipher. I knelt instinctively, fingertips brushing the moss, and suddenly memories and images flashed through my mind like shards of moonlight, visions of a prophecy I had only heard in fragments as a child, warnings of a Luna whose presence would awaken forces both protective and dangerous, threads of fate entwined with the Alpha, the pack, and the unseen shadow of a rogue wolf, a guardian and messenger whose knowledge of the hidden layers of our world was both deep and unyielding. Kael's red eye flickered from the darkness, and for a moment, I thought I could hear his quiet murmur carried on the wind. Not all who lead are as they seem, and not all who watch are silent by choice. And the words settled in my chest, igniting a current of understanding that threaded through the images and sensations building in me. A realization that the Alpha I had begun to trust, respect, and bond with carried within him secrets, burdens, and connections I had not yet grasped, yet that these were not necessarily threats, but pieces of a larger pattern, a tapestry woven with care by forces unseen. As I pieced together the fragments, the whispered hints, the dream flashes, the small coincidences I had once dismissed as chance, I saw the threads converge in a vision of the pack not as a single entity bound by instinct alone, but as a living organism shaped by prophecy, loyalty, and unseen currents of power, with the Alpha at its center, guided subtly by Kael's shadowed presence, whose role was to test, observe, and influence without revealing the full measure of his intentions. My chest tightened as I realized the magnitude of what I was sensing. The bond between the Luna and Alpha was not merely emotional or instinctual, but threaded through with destiny, a path preordained yet flexible, influenced by choices, courage, and awareness, and I understood why Kael had appeared so often in the shadows, why his red eye had lingered in my peripheral vision, why his whispers had come at moments when clarity was needed. He was the keeper of the balance, a guardian of hidden knowledge, a subtle guide, whose purpose was to ensure that the forces converging in this forest unfolded in harmony, even if the cost of ignorance or misjudgment was high. And then the Alpha moved closer, not with threat, but with deliberate intent, and I felt the pull of destiny tighten around me like a rope drawn by invisible hands, as though the very forest had conspired to bring us to this exact moment. And as he stopped a few feet away, amber eyes meeting mine, I glimpsed in the corner of my vision Kael retreating into the shadows, leaving only the faintest glimmer of red, a silent sign that what was about to be revealed had been prepared for, guided, and measured in advance. The Alpha's gaze seemed to search not just my eyes, but my understanding, probing the depth of my awareness, and I realized that the revelations of the night were not solely his to impart, but ours to navigate together, a mutual discovery threaded through with tension, trust, and unspoken acknowledgement that the stakes were far higher than I had yet comprehended. And then it happened, a sudden shimmer along the stream, where moonlight met water, a subtle disturbance that drew my attention, and I saw it. An emblem etched into stone beneath the current of the stream, glowing faintly with silver light, a symbol I recognized from the fragments of the prophecy, one that spoke of the Luna's true power, the Alpha's hidden heritage, and the unseen force that Kael represented, and in that instant, the forest itself seemed to inhale, holding its breath, as I realized that everything I had believed, the safety of the pack, the simplicity of the Alpha's leadership, the constancy of my own life, was now transformed, layered with meanings, connections, and a destiny I had not yet fully understood. And Kael's presence, silent and watchful, seemed to pulse in tandem with my realization, the red glow in the shadows flickering as if acknowledging my understanding, a subtle signal that the mysteries were not yet fully revealed, that the threads of prophecy, trust, and choice were now intertwined with a force both awe-inspiring and terrifying in its clarity. And as I looked up from the shimmering emblem to meet the Alpha's steady gaze, a single shocking truth crystallized in my mind, a revelation so profound and unexpected that it altered everything I thought I knew about him, about Kael, and about the destiny that had quietly been waiting in the folds of the forest all along. The Alpha I had been drawn to, the one I had begun to trust and bond with, was not only a leader by strength but a keeper of a legacy, a force shaped by secrets older than the forest itself, and Kael, the rogue shadow, had been the silent witness, the cryptic guide, the unseen hand ensuring that I would be ready to understand when the moment of truth arrived, leaving me trembling in awe, eyes fixed on the symbol beneath the water, heart pounding with the certainty that my life, and the world I thought I knew, had just shifted irrevocably. The forest no longer felt like the sanctuary it once had, its familiar rhythms fractured by the invisible currents of destiny and the subtle tremors of a world tilting toward uncertainty, and I walked the familiar paths with a new wariness, senses sharpened, heart tight, every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch, every ripple across the stream carrying a weight I could not ignore. The Alpha's presence was both grounding and disquieting, his amber eyes reflecting the tension that now threaded through the pack, his leadership tested by forces that seemed to press against the edges of the forest like a tide threatening to overflow, and I realized that my bond with him, which had grown steadily over days of quiet observation and shared moments, was now being challenged by events I could neither fully anticipate nor control. Kael, ever the shadow at the periphery of my awareness, appeared intermittently, a dark, muscular figure moving with perfect silence between the trees, his red eye catching glimmers of moonlight, and with each appearance the forest seemed to hold its breath, his subtle signals a mixture of warning and guidance, leaving impressions that were both cryptic and urgent. A low whistle through the wind, a paw print pressed into the soft earth, a flash of movement behind a thicket that vanished before I could fully focus. Instinctively, I followed the faint signs Kael left, feeling the tension in my chest grow with every step, a premonition that choices were piling on top of one another, consequences unseen yet imminent, the ordinary threads of my life unraveling as the currents of destiny, pack loyalty, and prophecy converged. The Alpha moved alongside me at moments, words measured, voice calm but heavy with unspoken concern, offering guidance, reassurance, and yet also a quiet reminder that our world was no longer stable, that even the smallest action could ripple outward into consequences neither of us could fully anticipate. And I felt the weight of responsibility pressing against my shoulders, heavier than any physical burden, as I realized that the forest, the pack, and even my own instincts were now intertwined with forces far larger than I had yet understood. And then the subtle disruptions began in earnest, shadows that flickered unnaturally, the wind shifting against the path I thought I knew, the stream's flow hesitating as if caught between currents, and the pack itself seemed on edge, movements quick, reactions sharp, eyes glinting with the awareness of danger that had yet to arrive but lingered in every glance. I caught glimpses of Kael moving along the edges of the trees, his presence a quiet punctuation to the rising tension, and at one point a low murmur, carried on a sudden gust of wind, reached me. The path splits where hearts falter, and I froze, the words anchoring themselves in my mind, a cryptic warning that my next choices would hold consequences not just for me, but for the Alpha, the pack, and perhaps even the forest itself. I felt my chest tighten as I realized that the delicate equilibrium we had maintained was fracturing, that the bond between the Alpha and myself, once a source of comfort and clarity, was now tested by the instability creeping through every element of our world, and that Kael's silent observation was both a reassurance and a challenge, a reminder that the rogue wolf's guidance came with the weight of unseen responsibility. The first tangible sign of change arrived in the form of a disruption at the far edge of the clearing, where trees bent unnaturally, branches snapping without wind, and the pack stiffened as though sensing a presence beyond our understanding. and I felt the pull of instinct mixed with fear, my mind racing to weigh the possibilities, to anticipate the alpha's reaction, to remain aligned with the currents Kael had subtly indicated. Yet uncertain of what choices would lead to safety or catastrophe, I stepped forward cautiously, heart pounding, noticing the faint gleam of red reflected in the undergrowth, Kael's signature, a quiet reminder to remain vigilant. And I understood, with the clarity that comes from sudden heightened awareness, that this was not a moment to hesitate, that the unstable threads of our world demanded action, decisions rooted in trust, courage, and intuition. Even when the outcome was uncertain, the Alpha approached the disturbance with measured steps, his gaze sharp, voice calm but firm as he instructed the pack to hold positions, and I felt the bond between us tighten in the silent acknowledgement of shared purpose. Yet the tension remained electric and unrelenting, carrying the sense that our ordinary world had shifted irrevocably, leaving us standing at the edge of forces we could not yet name or fully understand. Kael shifted again, his form a dark silhouette against the shadows, moving with fluid grace to a vantage point that allowed him to observe without revealing his presence, and I felt the silent weight of his scrutiny, a pulse of guidance threaded with warning, as if he was preparing me for the next revelation, the next test, the next moment where the stakes would rise beyond the reach of ordinary comprehension. And then, without warning, a tremor ran through the earth beneath my feet, subtle at first but growing in intensity, leaves and branches quivering as though echoing a message from the forest itself, and in that moment, a choice presented itself. Step forward into the unknown and confront the source of the disturbance, trusting the Alpha, the bond we shared, and the unseen guidance of Kael, or retreat and risk, leaving the pack exposed to forces beyond control. A decision that weighed heavily in my chest, constricting my lungs, sharpening my instincts, and demanding clarity I did not yet feel fully prepared to claim. I paused, fingertips brushing the moss underfoot, and sensed Kael's eye on me, glowing faintly from the darkness, a silent nudge that urged me to act with awareness and courage, to embrace the instability as part of the unfolding path rather than resist it. And in that charged instant, the forest seemed to align, shadows elongating and wind swirling as if acknowledging the tension of choice, and I realized that this was the moment where the ordinary world had fractured completely, leaving me suspended in the space between fear and determination, between hesitation and action, and that the decision I made in the next heartbeat would ripple outward, shaping not only my destiny but the fate of the Alpha, the pack, and the hidden currents Kael had so carefully observed and guided. Heart racing, breath caught in the cold night air, I took a deliberate step forward, the forest vibrating around me, every rustle, every distant howl, every whisper of wind magnifying the tension, and in that movement, the unstable threads of our world shifted once more, carrying with them the unmistakable knowledge that the events now unfolding were irreversible, that the choices before me were no longer merely personal, and that Kael, ever the shadow at the periphery of perception, had prepared me for this exact moment. His cryptic signs and silent vigilance culminating in the recognition that the stakes had risen far beyond what I had imagined, leaving me poised on the edge of action, every fiber of my being alert, and the forest holding its breath in anticipation of what would come next. The forest seemed to exhale a heavy, almost sentient sigh as I wandered along the familiar path, each step stirring memories that had long lain dormant, memories of a childhood shaded by quiet isolation, of nights when the wind carried whispers I did not understand, of the subtle ways I had always sensed the presence of something larger, something powerful threading through my life like an invisible hand guiding me toward a destiny I could not yet name. The Alpha moved nearby, silent for once, his amber eyes reflecting the dappled light of the forest floor as he watched the pack engage in their routines, and I sensed layers of his own history woven into his measured movements, the weight of responsibilities borne long before I had arrived, the echoes of losses and choices that had shaped him into the leader I now followed with growing respect and cautious admiration. And though he said little, the way he carried himself, the brief flickers of vulnerability in his expression spoke volumes, revealing the depth of a life tempered by duty, loyalty, and unspoken sacrifice. Kael, ever the shadow at the edge of perception, moved between the trees like liquid darkness, his red eye catching the light just long enough to remind me that he was watching, that he understood more than he revealed, that his silence was not emptiness but intention, and I felt the subtle tension of his presence threading through the air, a reminder that the truths we uncovered were only fragments of a larger, hidden story, one whose edges were blurred by time, secrecy, and the careful orchestration of unseen forces. I paused beside a stream, watching my reflection ripple across the water, and for the first time allowed myself to dwell on the parts of my own past I had pushed aside, the fear of inadequacy, the longing for connection, the quiet griefs no one had witnessed, and I realized that these threads, once hidden, were now entwined with the current of destiny flowing through the forest, that the Luna I had been was not separate from the bonds I was forming with the Alpha or the pack, but inseparable from them, the rawness of my own story lending clarity and strength to the choices I now faced. As the sun filtered through the leaves in shifting patterns of gold and green, I noticed the Alpha glance toward me, and in that silent moment I understood that he too carried pieces of history he did not speak of freely, the losses that had carved him into the wolf the pack relied on, the moments of doubt masked by control, the depth of care hidden beneath the weight of authority, and for the first time, I felt the threads of empathy stretch between us, delicate yet unbreakable, the recognition that understanding another required patience, observation, and the courage to see beneath the surface, to witness the shadow as well as the light. Kael's presence intensified the awareness, a constant reminder that observation was not passive, that every choice, every glance, every shared silence carried consequences that rippled beyond the immediate, and his faint cryptic signs, a subtle shift of leaves, a flash of red along the tree-line, the whisper of his voice in the wind saying, "Truth is found where shadows linger," guided me to notice the nuances I might otherwise have missed, encouraging insight without revealing conclusions, teaching me that understanding often comes from quiet patience and careful attention. As I followed the Alpha back toward the pack, I began to recognize patterns in their interactions, small gestures, fleeting looks, the unspoken language that bound them together, and I realized that each member carried stories of struggle, resilience, and loyalty, hidden layers of emotion that shaped the pack's strength and harmony, and that my growing awareness of these truths deepened my connection not just to the Alpha, but to the living organism of the pack itself, its heartbeat echoing the history and experiences of each wolf within it, each story a thread weaving the present into the tapestry of past and future. And then, as twilight painted the forest in muted shades of violet and silver, Kael appeared again, emerging from the shadows with deliberate grace, red eye glowing faintly, and for the first time, he approached close enough that I could sense the subtle, almost imperceptible pulse of his presence, a vibration that carried both warning and revelation, and though he spoke only one sentence, it struck me with the weight of truth I had not expected. The heart you trust carries its own secrets, and in that moment, I felt the layers of everything I had learned, the Alpha's quiet burdens, the pack's hidden histories, my own unresolved past, folding together into a single intense realization that the connections I had been cultivating were far more complex than I had imagined, woven with vulnerability, strength, and unspoken truths that demanded attention and understanding. The emotional resonance hit me fully as I watched the Alpha interact with the pack, noting the subtle tension in his movements, the brief flickers of recognition he offered to individuals who depended on him, and I understood that the bonds I had observed were fragile, tempered by history, and capable of both sustaining and challenging the strength of the pack, and that my own role within this network of relationships carried stakes I had never fully grasped, a delicate balance between influence, trust, and awareness. Kael remained at the edge of vision, a constant, silent presence, his red eye flickering in and out of sight, and I felt the weight of his observation, the subtle guidance that had threaded through every encounter and decision, and I realized that the rogue wolf's role was not simply to watch but to illuminate truths in shadows, to ensure that understanding came with depth, context, and timing, and that the revelations of the night would not merely inform my actions but change the lens through which I understood every bond, every choice, and every current that flowed through the pack and forest. And just as the moon broke free from a drifting cloud, illuminating the clearing in stark silver light, a single unexpected detail revealed itself, a faint symbol etched into the base of an ancient tree, one I had never noticed before, resonating with a meaning that tied together the hidden histories of the Alpha, the pack, and even my own lineage. And in that instant a shock of emotion surged through me, a twist that upended my understanding of loyalty, trust, and destiny, leaving me suspended between awe, fear, and clarity, my chest tight, my mind racing, fully aware that the story I thought I knew had only just begun to unfold, and that the shadows I had followed, guided by Kael's subtle wisdom, held the keys to a truth far deeper than I had ever imagined, a truth that would ripple through every bond, every choice, and every heartbeat yet to come. the forest, had begun to feel less like a home and more like a labyrinth of unseen pressures, each shadow carrying possibility, each rustle of leaves a question, and I moved through it with a heightened awareness, senses sharpened, instincts taut, knowing that the balance I had once relied on between the alpha, the pack, and myself was now being tested in ways I could not yet fully predict. Subtle cracks appeared in what I had thought unshakable, the way certain pack members avoided my gaze, the lingering tension when decisions were made, the flicker of doubt in the alpha's amber eyes, and though he remained composed, I could sense the currents of uncertainty threading through every interaction, pulling me into the same storm of unease that seemed to grip the forest itself. Kael was present as always, moving like liquid shadow along the edges of perception, his red eye flashing briefly from behind trees, leaving behind faint traces that whispered warnings I could almost hear. A bent branch here, a paw print there, a movement in the underbrush that suggested he had been watching even more closely than before, and I felt the weight of his observation pressing gently against my consciousness, a reminder that the choices I made now, the trust one placed in others, would have consequences beyond what I could measure. The first challenge presented itself in the subtle shifts of the pack's behavior, the way murmurs of disagreement passed unnoticed by others but felt like tremors in the stability of our bonds, and I realized that my instincts, honed by the connection to the alpha and tempered by Kael's shadowed guidance, were the only compass I could rely on to navigate the growing uncertainty. Yet even my confidence wavered as doubts pressed in from all sides, making me question whether alliances were as solid as they appeared, whether loyalties would hold under strain, and whether the decisions we had made in the light of revelation were sufficient to meet the trials approaching. I noticed the alpha watching me more closely, his gaze a mixture of caution and reliance, an unspoken acknowledgement that the weight of responsibility was no longer his alone, that my perception and choices were now intertwined with his own, and I felt both the gravity of this trust and the stirrings of unease, a tension that threaded through every interaction, every gesture, every shared glance, as if the forest itself had aligned with the uncertainty, echoing our struggle in the rustle of leaves, the sway of branches, and the murmur of wind through the trees. Kael's presence intensified the awareness, a shadow moving silently through the periphery, signaling caution, subtle interference, guidance, and a reminder that even those who watched most closely did not always intervene directly, leaving me to discern truth from illusion, loyalty from deception, and hope from despair in a world where the ordinary rules no longer applied. As the days passed, tests became less tangible but no less profound. The alpha's instructions carried hidden layers, the pack's movements suggested tension that might erupt at any moment, and every decision I made, every step I took, rippled outward with consequences I could feel but not fully comprehend, and I began to understand that the forest, the bonds, and even Kael's guidance were all part of an intricate system designed to shape us, to challenge us, to reveal truths that could not be understood until the moment of reckoning arrived. One evening, as twilight spilled across the canopy in streaks of silver and violet, subtle disruption shook the equilibrium. A distant howl that carried an unfamiliar cadence, a scent that seemed out of place, a shadow moving against the light in a way that immediately drew my attention, and instinctively I turned, heart pounding, to catch the faint glimmer of Kael's red eye flickering from the underbrush, a silent signal that danger, challenge, or revelation was near, and that I must remain alert, cautious, and decisive in my next steps. The alpha approached, voice calm but with a quiet urgency that I could feel in my chest, and together we moved toward the source of the disruption, every movement measured, every decision weighed. Yet I could sense the pack's unease, the subtle hesitation in their responses, the uncertainty that had begun to seed cracks in what I had once perceived as stability, and I realized that the trust one had relied on, and that they had relied on, was being tested not with brute force but with subtle pressure, with the gradual erosion of certainty, with the tension that made each heartbeat feel amplified, significant, and fragile. Kael's cryptic presence became more pronounced as I navigated the uncertain terrain. A bent branch here, a faint whisper of wind there, a shadow shifting just beyond focus, each signal pointing toward a path I could follow or avoid, and I understood that his guidance, while indirect, was crucial to preserving balance, to anticipating outcomes, to understanding the unfolding dynamics between the alpha, the pack, and myself. And yet even with his subtle interventions, the choices I faced remained mine, and the weight of those choices pressed on me like the dense canopy overhead. As darkness settled and the moon cast silver patterns across the forest floor, I realized that the tension had reached a tipping point, that the fragile equilibrium we had maintained was now on the edge of collapse, and that the coming hours could determine the fate of trust, loyalty, and hope within the pack. Just as I was processing the full scope of this rising tension, Kael appeared in the clearing ahead, a fleeting shadow with that unmistakable red eye. His gaze locking on mine for a moment long enough to convey both warning and expectation, and I felt a chill run through me, understanding that the moment of action or perhaps separation was imminent. Then, without any overt threat, a subtle event shattered the fragile calm, a sudden movement among the pack, a shift in position that indicated dissent, hesitation, and the potential for fracture, and I knew instinctively that the trust one had cultivated, the hope I had nurtured, and the connections that had felt so stable were now being tested in ways I could not control, leaving me standing at the edge of uncertainty, heart racing, senses taut, and the forest holding its breath as the threads of loyalty, fear, and choice tangled together, leaving the alpha, the pack, and myself poised on the cusp of an unknown outcome, and Kael, silent as ever, receded into the shadows, red eye fading from view, leaving only the weight of anticipation and the undeniable knowledge that the rising tension would force decisions, separation, and revelations in the moments yet to come. The night hung heavy with tension, the forest alive with a restless energy that made each snap of a twig or whisper of wind resonate like a drumbeat in my chest, and as I stepped into the clearing, I felt the full weight of every choice, every bond, and every unseen force pressing upon me, knowing that the confrontation awaiting was not just about loyalty or instinct, but about understanding the deeper currents that threaded through the alpha, the pack, and the shadowed presence of Kael, whose glowing red eye lingered in the distance, silently measuring, weighing, and guiding without a word. The alpha was there, tall and steady, amber eyes fixed on a point beyond me, the air between us thick with the unspoken understanding that what we were about to face demanded courage, clarity, and an unwavering heart, and yet even in his poised exterior I sensed the undercurrent of tension that mirrored my own, a reflection of the uncertainty, the stakes, and the fragile trust now hanging by threads woven through days of shared moments, secrets, and subtle revelations. Kael moved along the perimeter of the clearing like liquid shadow, every step precise, deliberate, and unseen except for the faint flicker of his glowing eye, and I could feel the subtle influence of his presence, a guiding hand on the edges of perception, pushing me toward awareness, caution, and insight while never intervening directly, reminding me that the confrontation we faced was ours to navigate, that our choices, not his, would shape the outcome, and that his cryptic observation was both shield and compass, illuminating paths I might overlook in the storm of emotion and instinct. As the moment stretched taut, the forest seemed to lean in, branches swaying with anticipation, leaves rustling like whispers, and I realized that every heartbeat carried significance, that even the smallest gesture, glance, or breath could tip the balance, and that the confrontation was not merely a test of strength but of understanding, empathy, and the courage to act with intention in a world where the ordinary rules no longer applied. The first wave of challenge revealed itself in the subtle tremors of the pack, movements hesitant, eyes flickering with uncertainty, the undercurrent of fear mixed with loyalty, and I felt the weight of responsibility press harder on my chest. Knowing that my choices would ripple outward, affecting not just the alpha and myself, but every member of the pack whose trust and well-being now rested, at least partially, on my awareness, decisiveness, and alignment with the currents Kael had so carefully signaled through shadows, whispers, and the faint gleam of red from beyond the trees. I stepped closer to the center of the clearing, breath shallow, senses attuned, and for the first time I allowed myself to consider the magnitude of the stakes, the pack's unity, the alpha's trust, my own emerging understanding of the prophecy and hidden truths, and the unspoken force Kael represented, all converging in this single, fragile moment where hesitation could unravel what had taken days, months, or even lifetimes to cultivate. The alpha moved deliberately toward me, amber eyes softening, and in the brief, charged silence our connection pulsed with unspoken words, shared understanding and mutual reliance, a tether in the storm of uncertainty that grounded me even as adrenaline surged, making each second stretch longer, heavier, more vital, and I realized that this confrontation demanded clarity of heart as much as clarity of mind, that courage alone was not enough, and that the bonds I had nurtured were now as much a responsibility as they were a source of strength. Then came the surge, a sudden shift in the forest's energy, the wind stirring with an almost sentient awareness, leaves trembling, shadows stretching. unnaturally, and I sensed the unseen currents reacting to our collective focus, to the convergence of trust, tension, and destiny. And it was in that charged instant that Kael's eye flashed from the darkness, a silent signal that the moment to act had arrived, that choices must be made, decisions weighed, and consequences embraced. Yet even as I understood the directive, the specifics remained veiled, demanding intuition, courage, and instinct. The Alpha spoke, voice calm but resonant with the weight of command and care, outlining the steps we must take to navigate the confrontation. His words threading through the tension with precision, and I felt the delicate balance between trust, action, and caution tighten around me like a living force, every instinct attuned to the smallest variation in movement, sound, and expression among the pack, the forest, and the unseen observer whose role had never been more clear. As we moved in synchronization, navigating the subtle tests, missteps, and hidden traps that the forest presented, I realized how deeply Kael had guided our awareness, how his presence had prepared us without overt intervention, and how the interplay of choice, observation, and understanding had brought us to this nexus where the ordinary world had fractured, leaving only clarity of purpose and the need to act decisively amidst the storm of emotion, uncertainty, and latent power. Just as the confrontation seemed to reach its apex, a sudden, unexpected tremor coursed through the clearing, accompanied by a faint but unmistakable flash of energy along the edge of the trees, and instinctively I turned, heart hammering, to glimpse Kael frozen in a perfect silhouette, red eye blazing, every muscle tense, signaling danger, revelation, and a moment that could not be ignored. The Alpha moved to intercept, positioning himself between the unseen source of disturbance and the pack, and I felt the weight of destiny pulse through me as I realized that the choices I made in the next heartbeat could shift the outcome, save or fracture trust, and alter the trajectory of everything I had fought to understand and preserve. The air thickened, every sound amplified, every shadow alive with possibility, and I stepped forward with deliberate intent, ready to act, guided by instinct, connection, and the subtle signals Kael had provided. Yet even as we prepared to face the culmination of tension, the forest itself seemed to pause, holding its breath, and in that suspended cinematic moment, a sudden piercing flash of light erupted from the far edge of the clearing, accompanied by a sound that was not quite a roar, not quite a crash, leaving me frozen, senses overwhelmed, and the Alpha rigid with anticipation. And in the last instant before understanding could settle, Kael's figure blurred into the darkness, his red eye lingering like a warning, a promise, and a question, leaving the confrontation unresolved, every outcome hanging in perfect suspense, and the forest trembling with the knowledge that the final act of destiny was drawing near. A moment whose resolution would demand everything we had learned, all the trust we had nurtured, and the courage to face the unknown together. Yet separately, as the shadows and light danced on the edge of revelation, the forest was alive with a tension that felt almost sacred, each rustle of leaves, each whisper of wind, each subtle movement of the pack carrying the weight of destiny, and I stepped into the clearing with a heart that throbbed not only with anticipation but with the profound awareness that everything I had learned, every bond one had formed, every truth I had glimpsed, was converging in this singular moment of reckoning. The Alpha stood at the center, tall and resolute, amber eyes reflecting both determination and vulnerability, a living embodiment of the path we had walked together, and I felt the gravity of connection, trust, and shared purpose pressing against me like the forest itself had drawn us into its pulse. Every breath and heartbeat synchronized with the undercurrent of forces beyond comprehension, guiding us toward clarity, understanding, and resolution. Kael was there too, as always, a shadow at the edge of perception, his muscular form blending seamlessly with darkness, the red glow of his eye cutting through the gloom like a signal of hidden truths, and I felt the quiet weight of his presence, the understanding that he was not merely a witness but a subtle architect of perception, a guardian of balance whose influence had threaded through every decision, every observation, and every step that had led me here. And as I turned to him, he spoke in a voice carried on the wind, calm and deliberate yet layered with meaning. Destiny is not given, it is revealed to those willing to bear the truth. And in those words the forest seemed to still, the trees themselves bending to listen, leaves trembling as though absorbing the weight of insight, and I understood in that instant that Kael's role had always been more than guidance. He had been the mirror, the tester, the silent herald of clarity, challenging me to face not only the Alpha and the pack, but the reflection of my own courage, vulnerability, and resilience. The Alpha approached, movements deliberate yet gentle, and I felt the unspoken bond between us tighten, threads of connection pulsing through instinct, empathy, and shared understanding, and in the way he looked at me, I saw the culmination of trust, loyalty, and hope woven through every trial, every revelation, every subtle challenge we had faced together, the recognition that we had grown not only in strength but in awareness, and that the bonds we nurtured now carried both the weight of history and the promise of future harmony. Around us the pack shifted, a living, breathing network of presence and awareness, their eyes reflecting recognition, loyalty, and the subtle tremors of uncertainty that had accompanied each step, each choice, each test, and I felt the collective heartbeat of the pack merge with my own, a rhythm that both grounded me and elevated me, carrying me toward the peak of understanding. That every instinct, every emotion, and every moment of hesitation had been part of the tapestry leading to this apex. The revelation that had been building through days, nights, and the hidden signs of Kael's cryptic guidance finally crystallized as the moonlight illuminated a faint symbol on the forest floor, etched into the earth, resonating with prophecy, lineage, and the destiny we had been weaving together, and I realized with a shock of awe and clarity that the path we had traversed, the choices made in fear, trust, and courage, had not merely shaped the present but had subtly transformed the energy of the forest itself, the pack, the alpha, and even me, leaving ripples of awareness, strength, and profound emotional resonance. The moment demanded acknowledgement, a subtle surrender to the currents of fate, and I found myself making a quiet, almost imperceptible sacrifice, not of life or love, but of certainty, of control, of the need to know every detail, accepting instead the flow of destiny, the trust in others, and the recognition that true strength often requires letting go. That some bonds are deepened not by insistence but by understanding, patience, and the willingness to embrace uncertainty with courage. As I stepped forward to acknowledge this truth, Kael's figure moved like liquid shadow along the edge of the clearing, and I caught the brief, piercing gleam of his red eye, a signal of approval, of acknowledgement, and of the deeper truth I had only begun to grasp, that the rogue wolf's presence had always been a catalyst for growth, a keeper of insight, and a reminder that the unseen, the mysterious, and the subtle are often as vital as the visible and immediate in shaping destiny. The alpha reached my side, voice soft but resonant, words carrying both reassurance and recognition, and in that moment, the forest seemed to pulse in harmony with the emotional crescendo, every leaf, branch, and shadow participating in the climax of understanding, trust, and connection, and I felt a profound shift within myself. A transformation that was neither abrupt nor explosive but subtle, deep, and irreversible, the kind that reshapes perspective, fortifies courage, and aligns heart and instinct with purpose and destiny. The pack responded, a subtle realignment in posture, gaze, and energy, reflecting the unspoken acknowledgement of the journey, the growth, and the revelation of emotional truths that had been hidden, nurtured, and finally revealed. Through shared experience, instinct, and the quiet guidance of Kael's watchful presence. And as I stood there, heart full, mind alert, and spirit intertwined with the pulse of the forest, I realized that this emotional peak, the culmination of trust, discovery, courage, and quiet sacrifice, was not an ending but a prelude, a point of profound clarity before the final step, where the threads of destiny, loyalty, and insight would demand their ultimate resolution. And Kael's red eye, lingering in the shadow at the periphery of perception, seemed to say more than words ever could, a promise that the final act was coming, a challenge that would test every bond, every choice, and every heartbeat yet to come, leaving me suspended in awe, awareness, and anticipation, fully transformed and ready for the last step toward destiny. The forest awakened slowly to the soft light of dawn, the mist curling like delicate ribbons around ancient trees, and in that quiet, golden hour, I felt the weight of every trial, every choice, and every subtle test finally settle into the rhythm of peace. Resonance that threaded through the alpha, the pack, and even the lingering presence of Kael, whose shadowed form slipped silently between the trees, unseen yet undeniably there. A constant reminder that mysteries are never fully unraveled and that the world holds more secrets than answers. His faint red eye catching the light for a brief moment before vanishing again, leaving only a whisper in the wind that seemed to say, "Every end is a beginning." And I understood, with the clarity only the culmination of struggle and growth can bring, that the bonds forged through courage, trust, and emotional truth were now unbreakable, interlacing our destinies with the heartbeat of the forest itself. The alpha stood beside me, amber eyes reflecting the soft glow of sunrise, a presence both grounding and inspiring, and as I looked at him, I felt the culmination of every lesson, every revelation, and every moment of doubt crystallize into a profound sense of connection, the quiet acknowledgement of a shared journey, and the knowledge that the threads of destiny, loyalty, and care we had woven together were strong enough to withstand both seen and unseen forces. The pack moving around us with a sense of harmony and renewed purpose, every glance, movement, and gesture signaling trust, unity, and the deep understanding that comes only from shared trials and emotional honesty. The forest itself seemed to echo this newfound equilibrium, sunlight streaming through the canopy in golden beams that danced across the mossy floor, highlighting details that had previously gone unnoticed, illuminating symbols and paths in the earth that whispered of lineage, prophecy, and the invisible currents that guide those willing to heed them. And I realized that the journey, though challenging and filled with moments of doubt, had brought not only clarity and understanding but also the quiet joy of witnessing transformation, the emergence of strength, and the deep, enduring beauty of bonds forged in trust and illuminated by insight. Kael appeared one final time, emerging from the shadows with the precision and grace that had defined every appearance, his red eye glowing faintly as he paused on a high branch, his gaze sweeping the clearing, the pack, the alpha, and me, and in that brief cinematic moment, he lifted his head and let out a low, haunting howl, the sound carrying through the forest like a ripple of recognition, warning, and farewell, reverberating against trunks and leaves, leaving a memory that felt both complete and open-ended, a subtle promise that his story, like ours, was ongoing, layered with mysteries that might one day return to test, guide, or reveal anew. I felt a deep, settling calm as I watched him disappear into the shifting shadows, leaving only the sense of presence, guidance, and the subtle reminder that some forces are eternal observers, shaping the currents without stepping fully into the light. And I turned back to the alpha, who extended a hand. In quiet acknowledgement, and in that simple gesture, I saw the culmination of trust, destiny, and emotional resilience, the shared understanding that love, quiet, steadfast, and nurtured through trials, was the most powerful bond of all, capable of uniting hearts, guiding choices, and sustaining the pack even as the mysteries of the forest remained vast and unknowable. The pack gathered around us, movements fluid, eyes reflecting both recognition and hope, and I felt the pulse of connection, the invisible threads of loyalty and care weaving a tapestry that stretched from the past into the present and toward a future filled with possibility, each member contributing to the shared energy that now hummed softly beneath every leaf, every branch, and every shadow. And I understood that while challenges would always arise, the strength of the bonds, the clarity of the heart, and the subtle guidance of those who watch from beyond the edge of perception, Kael among them, would carry us through, shaping destiny not by force but through insight, trust, and courage. As the sunlight grew warmer and spilled across the clearing in waves of gold, I took a final slow breath, feeling the culmination of every emotion, every lesson, every risk, and every revelation settle into a quiet, radiant certainty, and I allowed myself to smile, not from triumph, but from the deep satisfaction of understanding, of belonging, of embracing the journey fully and with an open heart, knowing that the threads we had woven together, the alpha, the pack, the forest, and even Kael's mysterious influence, were now a living testament to resilience, destiny, and the enduring power of connection. And as I cast one last glance toward the horizon, the rising sun illuminating every detail in a breathtaking tableau of light and shadow, I saw Kael's silhouette recede into the distant trees one final time, the red glow of his eye fading into the morning, leaving behind a sense of reverent awe, quiet mystery, and a promise that even as one chapter closes, the currents of destiny, courage, and subtle supernatural influence continue guiding, observing, and shaping the lives of those attuned to the rhythm of the forest and the heartbeat of the pack. A cinematic, unforgettable image that marked both an ending and a beginning, the sunrise painting every tree, shadow, and leaf in gold, symbolizing hope, continuity, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the trials that had brought us to this moment.